Welcome to Shadow Frames, where forgotten images reveal their darkest secrets. The black and white photograph seems unremarkable at first glance. A somber funeral procession from 1908. 6 men in dark suits carry an ornate wooden coffin across the grounds of Ravenwood Cemetery, their faces appropriately grim beneath bowler hats. Mourners trail behind, women in high-necked black dresses, men with heads bowed. Victorian mourning at its most proper. The photograph languished for decades in the archives of the Camden Historical Society, catalogued simply as Funeral Procession, Autumn 1908. Nothing special among thousands of similar images from the era. No notation of the deceased's identity. No indication of anything unusual. But last year, during the Society's digitization project, archivist Eleanor Marsh noticed something peculiar about the image. The resolution of modern scanning had revealed details invisible to previous viewers. I was enhancing contrast on the funeral image when I noticed something about the pallbearers, Eleanor explained in her research notes. Their grip on the coffin seemed unusual. When Eleanor zoomed into the high-resolution scan, the photograph revealed its secret. The coffin lid was slightly ajar, just enough to see inside, and the coffin was empty. Further examination confirmed what seemed impossible. No body. No shroud, nothing but polished wood interior gleaming in the autumn sunlight. Yet the procession continued with perfect solemnity, as if bearing a beloved departed to their final rest. Historical records from 1908 show no reports of funeral disruptions, no cemetery desecrations, no missing bodies. The Camden Gazette from that week mentions 3 funerals at Ravenwood. Elderly businessman Thomas Whitaker, young mother Sarah Collins, and 9-year-old Frederick Pembroke, all supposedly buried without incident. More disturbing still are the mourners' faces in the background. In Eleanor's enhanced scan, their expressions don't match the occasion. Look closely at the woman in the second row, partially obscured by a black veil. Is that the beginning of a smile? The tall man behind the pallbearers, his eyes seem fixed, not on the coffin, but somewhere beyond the camera, his expression almost expectant. The pallbearers themselves present another mystery. Though they wear the formal attire of funeral attendants, their faces are unusually similar, almost identical in their bone structure and complexion, despite apparent age differences. Most unsettling is what Eleanor discovered when cross-referencing cemetery records with town census data from 1908. None of the people in the photograph match descriptions of Ravenwood Cemetery staff or known relatives of that week's deceased. In fact, none appear in any Camden records at all. Who were these people carrying an empty coffin with such ceremony? What happened to the body that should have been inside? Or perhaps more disturbingly, was there ever a body at all? The photograph raises haunting possibilities. A rehearsal for some darker purpose? An elaborate ruse? Or something more sinister? A ritual disguised as a funeral, hidden in plain sight among the ordinary sorrows of a small New England town? What we know for certain, in 1908, a group of strangers carried an empty coffin through Ravenwood Cemetery, their secret preserved in silver halide until modern technology revealed what they never intended anyone to see. Eleanor's discovery drew immediate attention from historical societies across New England. Within weeks, a small team of researchers descended upon Camden, among them Dr. Morris Whitney, a specialist in Victorian funerary practices from Boston University. What we're seeing is unprecedented, Whitney explained during his initial assessment. In the Victorian era, funeral processions were rigidly choreographed affairs. The empty coffin violates every social convention of the period. The team established temporary headquarters in the dusty back room of the Camden Historical Society. Walls soon covered with enlarged sections of the photograph, maps of 1908 Ravenwood Cemetery, and timelines of local events. The autumn air filled with the smell of old paper and strong coffee as they worked through nights, searching for answers. Research assistant Talia Chen discovered the first significant lead while examining town council minutes from July 1908. There's a reference here to a dispute with something called the Orpheum Society regarding cemetery access, she noted. The council denied their request for a private ceremony at Ravenwood, citing concerns regarding their unorthodox practices and outsider status. The further digging revealed scattered mentions of this Orpheum Society in regional newspapers between 1906 and 1910, always peripheral, always vague. A charitable organization, according to some accounts, a philosophical society, according to others. Their letterhead, found in correspondence with the mayor's office, featured an unusual emblem, a circle containing what appeared to be an empty vessel or container. Most telling was a cryptic entry in the diary of Josephine Caldwell, wife of Camden's postmaster. Her October 19, 1908 entry read, "Strange people at Mercer's boarding house this week. 6 men identical in manner if not in age. They speak little at meals, exchange glances rather than words. Mrs. Mercer says they've paid for 2 weeks, though they claim their business requires only 1 day. They call themselves representatives of the Orpheum Society, collecting a departed brother. Yet they arrived empty-handed and requested information about cemetery procedures. The diary entry was dated 3 days before the photograph was taken. Property records showed that the Orpheum Society owned no land in Camden, maintained no office, listed no local members. They appeared suddenly, conducted their strange processional with an empty coffin, then vanished from town records entirely. Most disturbing was Dr. Whitney's analysis of the mourner's attire. These aren't standard funeral clothes from 1908, he explained, pointing to subtle anomalies. The cut of the men's jackets is slightly wrong, more 1890s than 1908. The women's dresses show inconsistencies too. It's as if they assembled wardrobes based on descriptions rather than actual knowledge of current fashions. As research progressed, Eleanor discovered a final unsettling detail. The headstones visible in the photograph's background corresponded to real plots at Ravenwood Cemetery, except one. The ornate obelisk prominent behind the procession never existed according to cemetery records. When Eleanor visited modern-day Ravenwood with a surveyor, they found only flat earth where the monument should have stood. What appeared in 1908, photographed yet never built. What purpose did an elaborate funeral serve with no body to bury? The Orpheum Society had carried their empty coffin into history, leaving behind only questions and the lingering sense that they might someday return to complete their unfinished business. The mystery deepened when Professor Amelia Blackwell arrived from Miskatonic University's Department of Anthropology. Unlike her colleagues, she came not to examine the photograph itself, but the obscure group behind it. The Orpheum Society appears in whispers across New England, she explained, spreading a map marked with red pins across the research table, always peripheral to documented history, yet peculiarly consistent in their methods. Amelia's research revealed similar incidents spanning decades: empty coffin processions photographed in Portsmouth in 1893, in Providence in 1900, and Salem in 1914, always conducted with solemn ceremony, always featuring the same number of pallbearers with uncanny similarities. These aren't isolated events, she insisted. They're performing something cyclical. The breakthrough came when Eleanor discovered a sealed envelope taped to the back of the original photograph's frame, overlooked during initial digitization. Inside was a single yellowed page, its handwriting faded but legible. They take what isn't theirs to claim. What looks dead is merely dormant. The vessel awaits its traveler's return. More puzzling was the sketch beneath these words. Concentric circles surrounding the same empty vessel symbol from the Orpheum Society letterhead. District cemetery records yielded another revelation. Though Ravenwood showed no record of a burial on that autumn day, groundskeeper Timothy Sullivan's maintenance log noted, "Filled in fresh opening at North Quadrant, though no burial scheduled. Earth disturbed, but no casket visible in whole." Society gentlemen insisted work was complete. Dr. Whitney consulted an anthropologist specializing in death rituals. "Some traditions perform inverse ceremonies," he explained after their discussion. "Not to bury, but to retrieve. The empty coffin might not represent absence, but preparation. A vessel readied for something's return." The most troubling development came when Talia cross-referenced astronomical records from October 1908. The week of the mysterious procession coincided with a rare celestial alignment. Mercury, Venus, and Mars, forming an unusual triangular configuration visible from New England. The same alignment occurred in 1893, 1900, and 1914, Talia noted, voice dropping to a whisper, matching every documented Orpheum Society appearance. When calculated forward, the pattern would next repeat in 3 months' time. Eleanor found herself waking from increasingly vivid dreams, 6 identical men standing in her bedroom, their faces expressionless, asking if she would help prepare the vessel. The dreams always ended with them opening an empty coffin, gesturing for her to look inside, where only darkness deeper than the wood's shadow waited. Local historian Martin Cranfield, initially skeptical of their research, arrived one morning ashen-faced. "My grandfather was deputy sheriff here in 1908, he said, placing a small leather-bound notebook on the table. "I found his private journal in our attic. There's an entry from the day after that photograph was taken." The journal described 3 unidentified bodies discovered in the woods beyond Ravenwood, drained of blood, with peculiar incisions at the base of their skulls. The deaths were never officially recorded, the bodies quietly buried in unmarked graves by order of Camden's mayor, who feared mass hysteria should the public learn what walks among them. The final journal entry simply read, "They required vessels. God help us when they return to fill them." As the research team delved deeper into the Orpheum Society's activities, word of their investigation spread beyond academic circles. An unmarked package arrived at the Camden Historical Society addressed to Eleanor. Inside lay a weathered journal bound in faded maroon leather, its pages brittle with age. The journal belonged to Meredith Holloway, a nurse at Camden Sanatorium from 1905 to 1910. Her entries documented a patient admitted 3 months before the empty coffin procession. A man found wandering the woods outside town, mute and disoriented, with no identification. "Patient X responds to no stimuli," Meredith wrote. "Physically healthy yet entirely vacant. His eyes track nothing, his body moves only when manipulated. Dr. Harmon calls it a profound catatonia, but I've observed something else. At precisely midnight, for exactly 6 minutes, he whispers in a language none of us recognize." More disturbing were Meredith's descriptions of 6 identical visitors who appeared at the sanatorium claiming to be the patient's brothers. They requested private time with him, which Dr. Harmon granted despite Meredith's objections. "They formed a circle around his bed," she recorded after secretly observing them. "They placed their hands on his skull in a strange pattern, pressing at specific points as if opening something that wasn't meant to be unsealed. Patient X convulsed violently, then grew still. Afterward, his condition appeared unchanged, yet something in his eyes seemed different, as if what looked out was no longer empty, but occupied by something foreign. 3 days after their visit, Patient X vanished from his locked room. The sanatorium record listed him as deceased, though Meredith's journal contradicted this. No body was found. His bed was empty at morning rounds, the window still locked, no sign of forced exit. Dr. Harmon ordered his death certificate prepared regardless, insisting, "Some matters are better concluded than questioned." The date of the patient's disappearance, the night before the empty coffin procession. Most chilling was what Eleanor discovered pressed between the final pages, a faded photograph of Patient X. The man's vacant face matched exactly that of the tallest pallbearer in the funeral procession, the one whose eyes had seemed fixed beyond the camera. Meanwhile, Talia's research into property records revealed that the Orpheum Society had recently purchased an abandoned farmhouse just outside Camden, 3 weeks ago, through a series of shell companies and trusts nearly impossible to trace. Professor Blackwell organized an exploratory visit to the property. They found the farmhouse empty but meticulously renovated, its basement housing a single object, a modern replica of the ornate coffin from 1908, crafted from the same distinctive wood. On the basement wall hung a calendar with the approaching celestial alignment date circled in red. Beneath it, a handwritten note. "The vessels have been prepared. The travelers return. After 115 years, the cycle completes." Eleanor's phone rang that evening, the security company monitoring the Camden Historical Society. The carefully preserved original photograph had gone missing from its climate-controlled storage. The only evidence of intrusion, 6 sets of nearly identical footprints in the dust, and a business card left in the photograph's place. The card bore the now familiar empty vessel symbol and 5 words. "Thank you for your preparation." The celestial alignment approached, and Camden transformed. Tourists filled local inns, drawn by a lecture series on historical funeral practices, announced by the Orpheum Society just days earlier. Eleanor watched with growing unease as strangers in outdated clothing wandered town streets, their faces possessing that same unsettling similarity. Not identical, but as if sculpted by the same hand. "They're gathering," Dr. Whitney whispered during their emergency meeting in the Historical Society's basement. "I've counted 23 individuals with the same physical characteristics as our pallbearers." Amelia placed printouts from regional newspapers on the table. "They're not just in Camden. Reports of strange visitors in Salem, Portsmouth, and Providence, all locations with previous empty coffin processions. Whatever they're planning extends beyond our town. Eleanor had stopped sleeping entirely. Her dreams had evolved from visitations to participation, nightmares where she carried the empty coffin herself, her hands somehow knowing precisely where to grip the wood. She would wake gasping, her fingers cramped as if they'd been bearing actual weight. Martin Cranfield burst into their meeting, clutching town medical records. There are 6 patients at Camden Memorial Hospital in unexplained catatonic states, admitted over the past 3 weeks. All found wandering in the woods, all unidentified, all completely unresponsive except at midnight, Eleanor finished, for exactly 6 minutes. That night, they established surveillance at the hospital, Professor Blackwell hiding in a supply closet near the ward containing the catatonic patients. Her frantic call came at 12:33. "They took them," she whispered, her voice trembling. 6 men in orderly uniforms wheeled them out through the service entrance. The night staff didn't even look up, as if they couldn't see them at all. By morning, the hospital records showed all 6 patients deceased from natural causes. Death certificates had been properly filed, bodies reportedly transferred to the county crematorium. When Eleanor called to verify, the crematorium had no record of receiving any bodies. The team gathered at the abandoned farmhouse that evening, watching from the cover of nearby woods. Vehicles arrived steadily through dusk, vintage cars meticulously maintained, disgorging passengers in clothing that approximated modern styles but contained subtle anachronisms. "They're not even trying to hide anymore," Talia whispered. As night deepened, Amelia nudged Eleanor. "Look at the house foundation." A faint light emanated from beneath the structure, not the warm glow of incandescent bulbs, but a pulsing radiance that seemed to bend the surrounding shadows in impossible ways. The soil around the foundation appeared to shift and settle, as if something beneath the earth were stirring. Martin's field glasses revealed figures carrying 6 empty coffins into the farmhouse. Not the ornate Victorian casket from the photograph, but simple wooden boxes, unvarnished and utilitarian. "Receiving vessels," Dr. Whitney murmured. "Not meant to preserve but to transport." Eleanor's phone vibrated with an email notification from the custodian at Ravenwood Cemetery. The message contained only a photo. The ground where the mysterious obelisk had appeared in 1908 was now disturbed. The soil freshly turned, though no burial had been scheduled. The earth in Camden was opening. Whatever had left in empty coffins was preparing to return, and it required new vessels to complete its journey. The night of the alignment arrived with an unnatural stillness. No wind disturbed the trees, no animals called in the darkness. Eleanor and the team maintained their surveillance of the farmhouse from separate positions, communicating via text messages that increasingly showed delivery delays, as if something were interfering with the signals. "Movement at the cemetery," Talia reported at 11:43. 6 figures with lanterns at the disturbed earth site. Simultaneously, Dr. Whitney observed a procession emerging from the farmhouse. 6 identical men carrying occupied coffins now, their burden clearly heavy as they walked with synchronized precision toward vehicles waiting in the drive. Eleanor made a decision. "I'm approaching the farmhouse," she texted, ignoring the flurry of protests from her colleagues. Something pulled her forward, the same force that had haunted her dreams, a compulsion she could no longer resist. The farmhouse door stood ajar when she reached it. Inside, the furniture had been pushed against walls, creating a central space where concentric circles had been painted on the wooden floor. The air felt dense, charged with something Eleanor's scientific mind couldn't categorize. In the center of the circles lay the original photograph from 1908, her missing artifact, surrounded by 6 small objects that made Eleanor's breath catch. Human teeth, arranged in a perfect hexagon. A leather-bound book rested beside them, open to a page titled "The Transference Ritual." Eleanor's fingers trembled as she photographed the text with her phone. "The travelers require the vessel's connection to be severed completely. Extract the anchors, teeth preferred, to prevent the original consciousness from returning. The vessel must be emptied completely before occupation." A floorboard creaked behind her. Eleanor turned to find an elderly man watching her, his face bearing that now familiar similarity to the others. "You shouldn't be here," he said, voice surprisingly gentle, "though perhaps it's fitting. Your curiosity helped complete the cycle." "What are you doing to those hospital patients?" Eleanor demanded. The man smiled sadly. "Nothing they weren't created for. Empty vessels awaiting occupation. The original owners departed long ago. We ensure they cannot return." "Return from where?" "From where we send them." He gestured toward the ceiling. The spaces between your world and others. The travelers need bodies to exist here. We provide the exchange. From outside came the sound of car engines starting. The man checked an antique pocket watch. Midnight approaches. The alignment creates the doorway, but only briefly. We've waited 115 years for this particular configuration, the one that allows the Council of Six to return. Eleanor's phone vibrated with a final text from Amelia. Something's happening at the cemetery. The ground is moving, but not from digging. Something's pushing upward. The man took Eleanor's arm with surprising strength. You've been having the dreams, haven't you? That's no coincidence. The travelers recognized you. Your mind is compatible. With horrifying clarity, Eleanor suddenly understood why she had been compelled to come here, why the empty coffin dreams had felt so personal. She wasn't meant to witness the ritual. She was meant to participate in it. The farmhouse erupted with movement as figures emerged from shadowed corners. Eleanor tried to break free of the old man's grip, but his fingers remained locked around her wrist with impossible strength. "You misunderstand," he said, his voice betraying a hint of accent impossible to place. "We need 7 vessels this cycle, not 6. The council requires a chronicler, one who understands this era's knowledge systems." 5 men entered the room, forming a semicircle around Eleanor. Each wore clothing from different decades. One in Victorian formal wear, another in 1920s attire, yet another in 1970s garb. Yet their faces shared that unsettling similarity, like photographs of the same person taken across different ages. "We've watched you since you found our image," said the one in Victorian dress. "Your mind categorizes patterns exceptionally well. A perfect vessel for the archivist." Outside, the sky darkened unnaturally as clouds swirled above the farmhouse. Eleanor's phone lit up with frantic messages from her scattered team. Talia reported that the cemetery ground had split open entirely, revealing a chamber beneath that glowed with the same pulsing light visible under the farmhouse. Dr. Whitney described the coffin procession arriving at Ravenwood's gates, the bearers now moving with unnatural speed. "What happened to the original people?" Eleanor managed to ask, struggling against the old man's grip. "The actual patients?" The man in 1970s clothing smiled thinly. "They were never people, mere biological constructs, grown, not born, empty from inception, awaiting purpose." "That's not possible," Eleanor whispered. "Your science approaches the understanding," replied the Victorian. "Cellular cultivation, genetic engineering. Humanity already creates life in fragments. We've simply mastered the complete form." The grandfather clock in the corner began tolling midnight, each resonant chime vibrating through Eleanor's bones. The air within the painted circles shimmered like heat rising from summer pavement. "The alignment reaches perfection," announced the old man, consulting his pocket watch. The door opens. From her phone came Amelia's panicked voice in a voice message. "Eleanor, the cemetery. There are things coming out of that chamber. Not human. Their movements are wrong." "Oh God, they're looking at the coffins like they're trying them on for size." The men guided Eleanor toward the center of the concentric circles. The photograph on the floor had changed. The image no longer showed the funeral procession from 1908. Instead, it displayed Eleanor herself, standing in the exact position where she now stood, surrounded by the 6 men. "The photograph doesn't record the past," she realized aloud. "It projects the future." "Time is merely another boundary to cross," said the Victorian. "We documented what would happen because it always happens. The circle completes itself. The shimmering air within the circle condensed, forming a vertical tear in reality. Through it, Eleanor glimpsed a landscape of impossible geometry, angles that hurt her eyes to perceive, structures that seemed to fold through dimensions beyond normal perception. Something was approaching from the other side. 6 elongated silhouettes moved toward the opening, their forms undulating as if struggling to maintain cohesion without physical vessels to contain them. "The travelers arrive," the old man announced, releasing Eleanor's wrist to join hands with the others, forming a complete circle around her. "And you, Eleanor Marsh, will record their new age on Earth." The crack in reality widened, emanating a cold that wasn't merely physical, but seemed to pierce through to some deeper layer of existence. Eleanor's research instincts battled with primal terror as the approaching entities reached the threshold between worlds. "I won't be your vessel," she managed through chattering teeth, backing away but finding herself unable to leave the painted circles. Some invisible force held her within the boundary. The Victorian smiled with mechanical precision. "Resistance is merely a symptom of transition. Your consciousness will retreat to make space, just as all vessels do. But something wasn't proceeding as planned. The entities at the threshold paused, their amorphous forms rippling with what Eleanor sensed was confusion. The man in 1970s attire frowned, turning to the elder. The alignment is perfect. Why do they hesitate? Eleanor's phone buzzed against her hip. A final message from Dr. Whitney. Cemetery ritual interrupted. Martin broke their circle. 3 vessels empty and inert, others fleeing. Understanding dawned as Eleanor felt the farmhouse floor vibrate beneath her feet. The rituals were connected. What happened at the cemetery affected what could transpire here. With 3 vessels denied to them at Ravenwood, the complete transference couldn't proceed. The tear in reality flickered, contracting slightly. The entities beyond seemed to confer among themselves, their movements growing agitated. Eleanor noticed something else. The 6 men surrounding her were changing. The perfect synchronicity of their movements faltered. The Victorian's left eye began to twitch uncontrollably. The elder's fingers trembled. They're losing control of their vessels, Eleanor realized. How long has it been since the last exchange? How many years wearing bodies not your own? The elder's face contorted with fury. 115 years is nothing. We've inhabited this dimension for millennia, trading vessels when necessary. But something's different this time, Eleanor pressed, sensing vulnerability. Your vessels are failing faster than expected. That's why this alignment matters so much. A horrible transformation overtook the Victorian, his skin rippling like disturbed water, features momentarily losing definition before snapping back. All 6 men now exhibited subtle deformations, as if whatever inhabited them was struggling to maintain its grip. The tear between worlds pulsed violently, the entities beyond now pressing against it with desperate intensity. Not invaders, Eleanor suddenly understood, but refugees. Whatever process sustained them in human form was breaking down. You're not colonizers, she whispered. You're dying. The elder grabbed Eleanor with both hands, his fingers elongating unnaturally as his control slipped. We chose you because your mind could comprehend our existence. We need your body's genetic structure, untainted, adaptable. Our current vessels were prototypes, flawed. With you, we can create a new generation that won't deteriorate. Beyond the windows, Eleanor could see lights approaching through the woods, flashlights, headlamps. Her team, rallying with local authorities perhaps, coming to her aid. The tear in reality began to shrink as the celestial alignment passed its apex. The entities beyond were becoming frantic, their forms stretching toward the narrowing passage. The circle of men tightened around Eleanor, their bodies moving with the jerky discoordination of marionettes with tangled strings. If we cannot have 7, the elder hissed through a mouth that stretched too wide, then we will take what we can. Beginning with you. The entities lunged with unnatural speed, their human disguises slipping further with each movement. Eleanor instinctively raised her arms in defense as the Victorian's fingers, now elongated into something more like talons, reached for her face. But instead of making contact, his hand passed through her shoulder, leaving a numbing cold in its wake. Impossible, the elder snarled, his features rippling like disturbed water. The connection should be forming. Eleanor felt a strange resonance within her mind. Not an invasion, but a revelation. The dreams hadn't been their manipulation, but her own intuition warning her. She wasn't compatible with their possession. She was naturally resistant. Your calibrations were wrong, she said, sudden understanding flowing through her. I've been investigating you, thinking about you. My mind has been forming protections without even realizing it. Outside, voices called her name as flashlights swept across the windows. The tear in reality continued shrinking, now barely wide enough for one entity to pass through. The creatures beyond were abandoning their orderly approach, fighting among themselves for position. The man in 1970s attire suddenly collapsed, his body shuddering violently. His skin grew translucent, revealing not muscle and bone beneath, but a swirling darkness. His mouth opened in a silent scream as his form began to dissolve from the extremities inward. The vessels cannot sustain without complete transference, the Victorian gasped, his own features beginning to shift unpredictably. We are between states now, neither fully here nor there. The elder made a final desperate lunge toward Eleanor, but half his body passed through her while the other half remained solid, creating a grotesque bifurcation of his form. He howled in a language that hurt Eleanor's ears, the sound distorting the air around them. Our followers will build new vessels, he rasped, his voice echoing as if coming from multiple throats simultaneously. This setback is temporary. We have waited centuries before. We will wait again. The concentric circles on the floor began to glow with an internal light, their paint bubbling and smoking. Eleanor felt the invisible boundary holding her weaken as the ritual collapsed. She stumbled backward, finally breaking free of the circle. The front door splintered as Martin and Dr. Whitney burst in, accompanied by several local officers. They froze at the threshold, witnessing the impossible scene unfolding within. The tier between worlds sealed with a sound like tearing fabric, leaving the entities stranded on their respective sides. The 6 vessels, no longer recognizable as human, began to collapse inward, their borrowed forms unable to maintain cohesion without their otherworldly pilots fully integrated. "Don't touch them," Eleanor warned as one officer moved forward. The bodies were dissolving into puddles of organic matter, releasing a thick mist that smelled of ozone and decay. The elder's face, surprisingly intact even as his body liquefied, turned toward Eleanor one final time. "The Orpheum Society spans continents and centuries," he whispered, his voice now barely audible. "This vessel expires, but others wait. The next alignment comes. We are patient. We are eternal." His features collapsed into formlessness as the last traces of whatever had animated him departed. All that remained were 6 puddles of rapidly deteriorating organic material and the photograph on the floor, which had reverted to its original image, the empty coffin procession of 1908. The investigation didn't end with the dissolution of the vessels. While Camden authorities struggled to classify the incident, eventually settling on cult-related chemical exposure, Eleanor and her team knew their work had only begun. 3 weeks after that night at the farmhouse, they gathered at Miskatonic University in Professor Blackwell's private research room. Maps covered the walls, red pins marking confirmed Orpheum Society appearances, yellow pins indicating suspected activities. The pattern extended far beyond New England, Prague, Edinburgh, Kyoto, Alexandria, spanning centuries. "The oldest reference I've found dates to 1622, Amelia explained, pointing to a fragile manuscript under glass, a Dominican monk's account of processionals without purpose in Bavaria. 6 identical brothers carrying an empty casket through village churchyards during a celestial convergence. Dr. Whitney had been analyzing the degraded organic matter from the farmhouse. Whatever these vessels were, they weren't entirely human. The cellular structure shows deliberate modifications, almost like a hybridization between human genetic material and something else." Eleanor had spent these weeks recovering from more than physical exhaustion. The entity's attempted intrusion had left psychological after-effects, moments where distances seemed wrong, where colors appeared in spectrums she previously couldn't perceive, brief glimpses of geometries that shouldn't exist within 3-dimensional space. "The Elder's final warning keeps haunting me," she admitted. "The Orpheum Society spans continents and centuries." We interrupted one ritual, but how many others succeeded that night? How many vessels were filled while we stopped only those in Camden? Martin Cranfield placed a thick folder on the table. "I've been tracking unusual medical reports from the alignment night. 17 cases across North America of hospital patients in persistent vegetative states, suddenly showing brain activity, then disappearing from facilities. Similar patterns reported in Eastern Europe and Japan. Most disturbing was Talia's research into the Orpheum Society's corporate entities. The shell companies that purchased the Camden farmhouse led to a labyrinthine network of foundations, trusts and holdings controlling properties near astronomical research centers, physics laboratories, and ancient sacred sites. They have assets exceeding $3 billion, she reported. And their investment patterns follow a distinct timeline. Major acquisitions increase precisely 47 years before significant celestial alignments. Eleanor unfolded a star chart on the table. "I've calculated when the next alignment with similar properties occurs." She pointed to a date circled in red. 8 years from now. Not the major convergence they wanted, but potentially usable for smaller-scale transference. The room fell silent as implications settled over them. They weren't dealing with a defeated enemy, but merely one temporarily thwarted. The Orpheum Society's reach extended through time itself, patient, methodical, with contingencies spanning generations. "We should make this public," Dr. Whitney suggested. "Release everything we've learned." Eleanor shook her head. "That's exactly what they're prepared for." The elder didn't fear exposure. He practically mocked the idea. Anyone claiming that shape-shifting entities from another dimension are infiltrating human society would be institutionalized. Then what can we do? Martin asked. Eleanor pulled out the one item she'd kept from the farmhouse, the original photograph, now safely sealed in archival material. We watch, we record, we interrupt their rituals when we find them. And most importantly, she tapped the image of the empty coffin. We make sure their vessels remain empty. The photograph's discovery sent ripples through academic circles, bringing unexpected correspondence to Eleanor's desk. After publishing a carefully sanitized paper on anomalous funeral practices in early 20th century New England, she received an unmarked package from Switzerland containing microfilm reels from the archives of the League of Nations. "These might interest you," read the anonymous note. Orpheum activities weren't limited to America. Eleanor and Talia spent 3 days hunched over the microfilm reader, translating documents from 6 languages. In 1923, League investigators had documented a series of unusual medical phenomena across war-ravaged Europe. Patients in military hospitals suddenly awakening from comas, displaying radical personality changes before disappearing from facilities. Internal Memorandum, Case 47, one document began. Patient exhibited complete recovery from frontal lobe trauma previously deemed inoperable. Upon awakening, subject demonstrated fluency in 5 languages, not in his service record, and advanced mathematical knowledge inconsistent with his education. When questioned about his recovery, he responded only, "This vessel was empty enough to receive me." Most disturbing was a photograph tucked among bureaucratic reports. 6 identical doctors standing before a field hospital in Belgium, their faces bearing the now familiar physiological commonalities. The League investigator had circled their eyes in red ink, noting, "Pupils do not respond normally to light. All 6 maintain the same blinking pattern, as if synchronized." Professor Blackwell discovered an Orpheum connection even closer to home. University financial records from 1949 showed substantial donations from the Orpheum Educational Trust, earmarked for constructing Miskatonic's astronomy tower. The facility's precise coordinates aligned perfectly with the sightlines needed to observe specific celestial conjunctions. "They've been positioning assets for optimal viewing of these alignments," she explained. "Not just observing, capturing something from these cosmic events." Dr. Whitney returned from consulting with a colleague in quantum physics, his expression grim. "There's a theoretical framework that might explain their abilities," he said. "Consciousness as a wave function that can be transferred across prepared mediums. The modified bodies are simply receivers tuned to specific frequencies." Eleanor spent a week in the university archives, searching for historical patterns that might reveal future Orpheum targets. She emerged with bloodshot eyes and a revelation. "It's not just astronomy dictating their timetable," she announced. "There's a geological component. Every recorded empty coffin processional occurred within 10 miles of natural magnetic anomalies. They're using Earth's own field as an amplifier." Martin confirmed this theory with ground-penetrating radar surveys of Ravenwood Cemetery. Beneath the site of the mysterious obelisk lay a formation of magnetite, creating a natural distortion in the local electromagnetic field, a geological bullseye for whatever transmission the Orpheum Society had attempted. As they compiled these discoveries, Eleanor received a call from Camden's hospital administrator. 6 new patients had been admitted with identical symptoms, catatonic, unresponsive except at midnight, found wandering the woods near the abandoned farmhouse. The countdown to the next alignment had already begun. The catatonic patients became Eleanor's priority. She convinced the hospital administrator to isolate them in a secure wing under 24-hour surveillance, with strict visitor restrictions. Dr. Whitney installed discreet monitoring equipment to record any midnight vocalizations. "They're speaking in fragments," Eleanor explained during their emergency meeting 3 days later, playing the audio recordings. "Each patient utters different syllables that form complete sentences when combined sequentially." The team listened intently to the synchronized playback. "Vessels require celestial conduit, 9 points across, ley line convergence. Camden merely 1 node. Spectrum must complete." Talia cross-referenced geographical coordinates mentioned in the fragmented speech with their map of suspected Orpheum activities. "They're describing a network," she said, connecting points with a red marker. "Camden is just 1 vertex in an Enneagram pattern covering the northern hemisphere." "An antenna," Martin suggested, "or perhaps a signal amplifier." Professor Blackwell arrived with translations of the Orpheum Society's private correspondence from the 1920s, acquired through her contacts at the British Museum. They don't see themselves as invaders, she explained. Their internal documents consistently use terminology suggesting they're refugees from some catastrophic collapse in their home dimension. The correspondence referred repeatedly to the diminishing, an apparent entropic decay affecting their native realm, forcing them to seek temporary vessels in other dimensions while they constructed more permanent solutions. Most revealing was their description of human consciousness. The indigenous awareness occupying these biological constructs exists in a far narrower band of perception than our own. Their consciousness can be compressed to a peripheral experience during occupation, allowing our expanded awareness to utilize the vessel's full capacity. Eleanor shuddered at the implication. They're not replacing the original consciousness. They're forcing it aside, like mental parasites. Dr. Whitney's colleague in quantum physics had completed his analysis of soil samples from the Ravenwood site. The magnetite contains quantum signatures suggesting it briefly existed in multiple states simultaneously during the alignment. Whatever doorway they're opening involves actual manipulation of quantum probabilities. While cataloging items recovered from the farmhouse, Eleanor discovered a small leather journal hidden within the floorboards. The final entry, dated just before the failed ritual, contained a disturbing revelation. The vessel preparation continues at all 9 nodes. Camden progresses satisfactorily, though the unexpected awareness of the archivist female presents both risk and opportunity. Her mental architecture shows unusual resilience, potentially indicating a hybrid lineage from previous traveler incarnations. If her bloodline contains traces of our essence from past cycles, she may represent not merely a vessel but a bridge, the first successful permanent integration. The Council believes her resistance can be recalibrated into receptivity with proper conditioning. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read these words. The strange perceptions she'd experienced since the farmhouse incident took on new significance. Whatever connection allowed her to glimpse their reality went beyond simple exposure. Something in her genetic makeup, perhaps an ancestor who had served as a vessel generations ago, had left a latent inheritance in her DNA. She wasn't just their investigator. She was, in some small biological way, already part of them. Eleanor needed physical proof of her suspected genetic connection to the Orpheum Society's travelers. After discreetly collecting a sample of the residue from the dissolved vessels, she arranged for DNA analysis through Dr. Whitney's laboratory contacts, comparing it against her own genetic material. The results arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. Eleanor's hands trembled as she unfolded the report in her office, the steady drumming of raindrops against her window providing an ominous backdrop. Partial sequence matching detected, the report stated clinically. Subject's mitochondrial DNA contains anomalous structures consistent with sample material. Estimated genetic divergence, 7 generations. 7 generations. Eleanor calculated backward. A great-great-great-great-grandparent would have lived in the mid-19th century. She pulled out her family records, tracing backward through her maternal line until she found her. Elizabeth Marsh, born 1842, who had spent 6 months in an asylum following a nervous collapse, before making a miraculous recovery and returning home with altered temperament but improved intellectual capacity. The photograph of Elizabeth in Eleanor's family album showed a stern-faced woman with penetrating eyes that now seemed unnervingly familiar. Notes in the family Bible described her sudden proficiency in mathematics and astronomy following her illness, disciplines she had never studied. "They've been preparing my bloodline for generations," Eleanor whispered to the empty room. That night, her dreams took a different turn. Instead of the empty coffin, she found herself standing in what appeared to be a library with impossible architecture, shelves extending in defiance of perspective, books bound in materials that shifted color as she looked at them. A figure sat at a central desk, its back to her. "We've been waiting for you to understand," it said without turning. "Consciousness is not simple habitation of flesh. It's a spectrum across dimensions." "What do you want from me?" Eleanor asked. The figure slowly rotated, revealing a face that was both Elizabeth Marsh and something else entirely. "Not possession. Evolution. Your lineage has been gradually adapting to hold our consciousness without displacement of your own. A true synthesis." Eleanor woke, gasping. Her bedroom filled with a faint phosphorescent glow that faded as full consciousness returned. On her nightstand lay a book that hadn't been there when she fell asleep. bound in unfamiliar material that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. Inside, written in an elegant hand, was a single sentence: "The vessels need not be emptied if they choose to be filled." Eleanor called an emergency meeting the following morning. As the team gathered, she realized with growing unease that she could somehow sense their thought patterns, not reading minds, but perceiving emotional states as visible auras surrounding each person. "They're accelerating whatever's happening to me," she explained, careful not to mention the new perceptual abilities that even now were expanding. "I believe they're attempting a different approach, not replacement but integration. They want to create hybrids that can exist in both worlds." Martin looked skeptical. "Why would they change strategies now after centuries of the same approach?" "Because," Eleanor said quietly, "they're running out of time. Whatever catastrophe they're fleeing is accelerating, and they believe I'm their last best hope for survival." The atmosphere in Camden changed with the seasons, autumn leaves giving way to the first dusting of winter snow. As December settled over the town, Eleanor's transformation accelerated. She would wake to find equations scrawled across her bedroom walls in her own handwriting, mathematical formulations describing dimensional interfaces that no human mathematics could express. More disturbing were the moments when her perception would suddenly shift, everyday objects revealing geometric properties invisible to normal human senses. "It's like seeing the skeleton beneath the skin of reality," she tried explaining to Dr. Whitney, who watched her with increasing concern. The team had established a rotation, ensuring Eleanor was never alone as the changes progressed. During a medical examination, the neurologist discovered unusual activity in Eleanor's temporal lobe, patterns that shifted in perfect synchronicity with magnetic field fluctuations. Her blood work revealed cellular anomalies that the lab initially flagged as equipment errors until repeated tests confirmed their presence. "Your body is changing at the molecular level," Dr. Whitney explained gently. "The question is whether we can slow or reverse the process." Eleanor wasn't certain she wanted it reversed. The expanding awareness brought terror, but also exhilaration, knowledge flowing into her consciousness that answered questions humanity had struggled with for centuries. She found herself instinctively understanding principles of quantum entanglement that leading physicists were only beginning to theorize. One morning, she discovered the 6 catatonic patients had disappeared from the hospital. The security footage showed nothing. They were present in their beds at 11:59, gone at midnight, with no doors opening, no windows disturbed. That same day, reports came from the other 8 nodes in the pattern Talia had identified. Similar disappearances, all occurring simultaneously across different time zones. The Orpheum Society was consolidating its resources. "They're preparing for something imminent," Professor Blackwell warned after analyzing astronomical projections. "There's a minor alignment in 3 days. Not the main event they wanted, but perhaps significant enough for a limited transference." That night, Eleanor woke to find 6 identical figures standing in her bedroom, the missing patients, now fully animated, their expressions bland and identical. "The bridge nears completion," they said in perfect unison, voices overlapping in harmonics that made the air vibrate. "Your consciousness expands to accommodate ours. The synthesis approaches critical threshold." They approached her bed, forming a circle. One reached out, touching Eleanor's forehead with cold fingers. Instead of fear, she felt a sudden rush of connectivity, as if her mind had linked to some vast network extending beyond normal space-time. "What do you truly want?" Eleanor asked, surprising herself with her calmness. "Survival," they answered. "Our realm collapses. Entropy accelerates. We seek not domination but continuation. Your world has space and time we no longer possess." For the first time, Eleanor sensed something beyond their calculated manipulations, genuine desperation. These weren't conquerors, but refugees from a cosmic catastrophe, clinging to existence through increasingly desperate measures. The choice before her was becoming clear and terrifyingly simple: become their bridge, or watch them find another way, likely more violent, more complete in its displacement of human consciousness. The morning of the alignment transformed Camden with an otherworldly light, not from the sun, which remained hidden behind pregnant storm clouds, but from subtle luminescence emanating from the soil itself. Eleanor watched from her porch as iridescent patterns rippled across her lawn like oil on water, visible only when she tilted her head at certain angles. "They're showing me what they see," she realized, her perception now balanced between human limitation and something far beyond it. The team gathered at the Historical Society for what might be their final strategy session. Maps, photographs, and astronomical charts covered every surface, documenting their months-long investigation into entities that had walked among humanity for centuries, wearing borrowed flesh. "I've made my decision," Eleanor announced, her voice steady despite the gravity of her choice. "I'll become their bridge, not their vessel." The distinction was crucial. Where vessels were emptied to make space for foreign consciousness, a bridge would maintain its identity while allowing passage. Eleanor's unique genetic heritage made this possible, but the risk remained enormous. "There are thousands, perhaps millions of them," she explained, "but they don't need to physically occupy our world. They need a space within our dimension where their consciousness can persist as their own realm collapses." She unfolded a diagram her altered mind had conceived during the night. Concentric rings surrounding a central point, remarkably similar to the painted circles on the farmhouse floor, yet fundamentally different in purpose. Instead of bringing them here to displace us, we create a pocket dimension, a sanctuary within our reality but separate from it. They exist alongside without replacing. Professor Blackwell studied the diagram with widening eyes. "This would require energy on a scale we can't possibly generate." "We don't need to," Eleanor replied. "They'll provide it. What they lack is the anchor point, a consciousness that exists in both worlds simultaneously. Me." Outside, thunder rolled across Camden as unnatural energies gathered. Reports were coming in from around the globe of strange atmospheric phenomena centered on the 9 nodes of the Orpheum pattern. "If I don't do this," Eleanor said softly, "they'll become desperate. The next alignment is their last chance before total collapse. They'll take vessels by force, thousands of them." Dr. Whitney placed a hand on her shoulder. "How can we help?" "Protect my physical form during the transition. My body remains the anchor point between dimensions." They moved to Ravenwood Cemetery as twilight approached, setting up equipment at the site of the mysterious obelisk. The 6 identical figures waited there, standing motionless in the gathering darkness. Above, clouds parted momentarily, revealing the celestial bodies moving into their brief but critical alignment. Eleanor stepped into the center of the natural magnetic anomaly, feeling reality already growing thin around her. The knowledge flowing through her mind now was both terrifying and beautiful. The desperate exodus of beings fleeing cosmic entropy, seeking not conquest, but continuity. "Begin," she said, as the first stars became visible in the darkening sky. The 6 identical figures surrounded Eleanor, their hands raised as the magnetic anomaly beneath the cemetery pulsed with increasing energy. Lightning crackled between the headstones as the dimensional boundary began to thin. Eleanor felt her consciousness expanding beyond normal perception, experiencing multiple planes of existence simultaneously. The synthesis begins, the figures intoned, their voices harmonizing into otherworldly resonance. Dr. Whitney monitored Eleanor's vital signs from a safe distance, the equipment readings fluctuating wildly. "Her brainwave patterns are shifting into configurations I've never seen," he called to the others over the rising wind. Eleanor gasped as her awareness extended across the 9 nodes of the Orpheum pattern. She could simultaneously perceive the other locations around the globe: a temple in Kyoto, a cathedral basement in Prague, an ancient stone circle in Scotland, where similar rituals unfolded. At each site, the thinning veil between dimensions manifested differently. In Camden, it appeared as a slowly rotating spiral of light. Elsewhere, as crystalline structures or folding geometric patterns that human eyes couldn't properly comprehend. "They're coming through," Martin shouted, pointing to shimmering silhouettes gathering at the edges of reality. The entities, thousands of them, pressed against the dimensional boundary, their forms constantly shifting as they struggled to manifest in a reality with unfamiliar physical laws. Through her expanded consciousness, Eleanor understood their desperation. Their home dimension was collapsing in on itself, compressing entire civilizations into nothingness. "Not into our world," Eleanor commanded, using newfound authority that resonated across multiple planes, "into the space between." She mentally projected the diagram she had created, the pocket dimension that would serve as sanctuary rather than conquest. The entities hesitated, then redirected their flow toward this new destination. Eleanor felt their gratitude washing over her like waves as they realized her intention was preservation, not surrender. Professor Blackwell approached as close as the energy field would allow. "Eleanor, your physical form is becoming translucent." Indeed, Eleanor could now see through her own hands, her molecular structure vibrating between states of matter. Yet her consciousness remained firmly anchored to her identity. The bridge must extend in both directions, she realized aloud. Part of me must exist in their realm for the connection to stabilize. The cemetery ground cracked open as the obelisk that had appeared in the 1908 photograph materialized again. Not a monument, but a cornerstone between worlds. Symbols etched themselves across its surface, documenting the covenant between dimensions. As the celestial alignment reached its zenith, Eleanor felt countless minds flowing through her consciousness, not invading, but passing through the bridge she had become. She witnessed fragments of their existence. Cities built from thought, histories recorded in emotional frequencies, mathematics that shaped reality rather than merely describing it. "It's working," Talia confirmed, watching electromagnetic readings stabilize across all 9 nodes. "The transfer is nearly complete." Eleanor closed her eyes, finding herself simultaneously standing in both Camden Cemetery and on the shores of a dying universe, as the last refugees of a collapsing reality crossed the bridge she had become. Eleanor's physical form gradually solidified as the cosmic alignment passed its apex, her molecules vibrating back into synchronization with earthly reality. Yet her consciousness remained fundamentally altered, existing partially in both dimensions, a permanent bridge between worlds. The team gathered around her as dawn broke over Camden Cemetery, their faces displaying equal measures of relief and uncertainty. "I can still feel them," Eleanor whispered, her eyes tracking invisible movements through the space surrounding the materialized obelisk. "They're establishing their sanctuary in the fold between realities. Not quite here, not fully elsewhere." Throughout the following week, subtle changes manifested across the 9 nodes. At each location, electromagnetic anomalies created spaces where physical laws behaved inconsistently, patches of altered gravity, fluctuations in temporal flow, light that bent at impossible angles. The pocket dimension was stabilizing, anchored to our reality, without fully merging with it. In her apartment, Eleanor discovered she could now read the strange book that had appeared on her nightstand, its text shifting between languages she'd never studied, yet somehow understood perfectly. It contained the complete history of the entity's civilization, their rise and fall across billions of years in a universe with fundamental properties unlike our own. Their dimension had begun collapsing after they attempted to harness energies beyond their comprehension, triggering an irreversible entropic cascade. "They weren't always refugees," she explained to Professor Blackwell during their debriefing session. "They were scientists, artists, philosophers, a civilization far older than humanity. Their desperation came from watching everything they'd built dissolve into quantum chaos." Martin arrived with a disturbing newspaper clipping from 1943, a photograph showing 6 identical military officers at a weapons research facility. "How do we know they won't try again? What if some still want vessels instead of sanctuary?" Eleanor touched the base of her skull where occasional pain still flared, the physiological manifestation of her altered neurology. "The covenant works both ways. I'm their bridge, but also their gatekeeper. They cannot cross without my awareness." More profound was what Dr. Whitney's continued medical examinations revealed. Eleanor's cellular structure now contained quantum properties previously unseen in organic matter. Her cells existed in partial superposition, simultaneously present in both dimensions. "You're evolving into something beyond conventional humanity," he noted without judgment. "The question is, how much of Eleanor Marsh remains?" The answer came not in words, but in memories that surfaced with increasing clarity. Her childhood fascination with historical photographs, her graduate school determination, her instinctive compassion that had led her to offer sanctuary rather than resistance. The entities had chosen her precisely because her identity was strong enough to remain intact through the transformation. As winter deepened over Camden, Eleanor began documenting everything in a journal, not just the events but the impossible knowledge now flowing through her consciousness. Future generations would need to understand the invisible neighbors sharing their reality and the nature of the bridge that connected them. The final entry in her first volume read simply, "The shadow frames between worlds are now my home. I stand at the threshold, watching over both sides of an impossible doorway, neither fully human nor entirely other, but entirely myself." In the months following the creation of the interdimensional sanctuary, Eleanor found herself drawn repeatedly to the Camden Historical Society archives. The building felt different now. Its walls seemed permeable, occasionally shimmering when she viewed them through her altered perception. The archived photographs, particularly those containing hidden anomalies like the empty coffin procession, now revealed deeper layers of information previously invisible to human eyes. "You're becoming quite the regular again," remarked the elderly volunteer at the front desk. Unaware that Eleanor was simultaneously cataloging fluctuations in the pocket dimension while sorting through physical documents, Eleanor smiled. "Just tying up loose ends." Those loose ends included tracking down every known Orpheum Society appearance throughout history. With her expanded awareness, she could now perceive subtle markings in seemingly ordinary historical photographs, embedded sigils that had guided their operations across centuries. The empty coffin procession wasn't unique. It was simply the one where their careful staging had first been detected by human technology. During her research, Eleanor discovered an unmarked box containing glass plate negatives from 1872. One showed what appeared to be a normal railway station inauguration in Massachusetts, until she noticed the 6 identical figures standing at precise intervals around the crowd, their positioning forming a perfect hexagon around a central point, a young woman whose face was turned away from the camera. When Eleanor touched the negative, her consciousness momentarily connected with that moment in time. The young woman had been another potential bridge, another genetic descendant in the lineage they had cultivated. Eleanor felt the familiar resonance of partial traveler DNA, but something had gone wrong. The woman's mind had fractured during their approach, unable to sustain the connection. "They've been trying to create me for generations," Eleanor whispered, understanding now why the Camden ritual had been so crucial. She represented their last, best attempt at creating a stable bridge before their dimension collapsed completely. At Ravenwood Cemetery, the mysterious obelisk had become a focal point for unusual phenomena. Local residents reported hearing whispered conversations when no one was present, seeing brief flashes of impossible architecture superimposed over the gravestones, feeling momentary vertigo as if gravity briefly reoriented itself. The pocket dimension was settling into place, its boundaries occasionally brushing against human perception. Professor Blackwell had established monitoring equipment around the cemetery, recording these fluctuations. "The interface is stabilizing," she explained during their weekly meeting. "The separate dimension maintains integrity while remaining connected through specific anchor points." Most significant was what Dr. Whitney discovered while analyzing Eleanor's blood samples. Her altered cellular structure was producing compounds with remarkable properties. One protein demonstrated the ability to repair damaged neural pathways. Another showed potential for treating degenerative diseases. "Your transformation might benefit humanity in ways we never anticipated," he told Eleanor. "Their knowledge, filtered through your human understanding, could advance medical science by decades." As winter snow blanketed Camden, Eleanor walked through Ravenwood Cemetery, leaving 2 sets of footprints, one in the physical snow, another in the quantum realm where the refugee entities had established their new civilization. She was neither their savior nor their vessel, but something unprecedented, a conscious bridge between worlds, preserving both their existence and her humanity in perfect, precarious balance. Eleanor Marsh gathered her research team one final time in the Camden Historical Society basement. The culmination of their year-long investigation spread across tables in carefully organized folders. Outside, the first snowfall of winter transformed the town into a pristine landscape that betrayed nothing of the dimensional rift now permanently anchored at Ravenwood Cemetery. "The trustees are requesting our final report," she explained, her voice carrying subtle harmonic undertones that hadn't existed before her transformation. "How do we explain what we've uncovered without sounding like we've collectively lost our minds?" Dr. Whitney smiled wearily. "We tell a carefully edited truth. Mysterious funeral processions documented across centuries. Evidence of a secretive organization with unusual practices. Unexplained phenomena requiring further study. And we hide the rest," Professor Blackwell added, gesturing toward Eleanor's journal. 600 pages of impossible knowledge transcribed from her expanded consciousness. The journal documented what actually happened during those empty coffin processions throughout history. The travelers had been attempting sustained contact for centuries, each time getting closer to creating a suitable bridge. The 1908 photograph represented not the beginning but nearly the end of their journey, a carefully staged rehearsal for what they hoped would be their final transition. "The original photograph isn't just evidence," Eleanor said softly. "It's a beacon. It was meant to be discovered by the right person at the right time, someone carrying the genetic markers they'd spent generations cultivating. She opened her laptop to show them her latest discovery, a complete genealogical chart tracking her ancestry back 11 generations. At key points throughout the lineage, ancestors had experienced mysterious illnesses, followed by remarkable recoveries and unexplained changes in personality or ability. Elizabeth Marsh in 1842, Samuel Marsh in 1791, Johanna Marsh in 1667, each representing an attempted connection that partially succeeded, gradually modifying the genetic line to eventually produce Eleanor, the perfect bridge. The Orpheum Society wasn't trying to hide their activities, she explained. They were documenting them, leaving breadcrumbs through time that would eventually lead to this moment. Martin shuffled uncomfortably. That still doesn't explain why they carried empty coffins. Eleanor's altered perception allowed her to see the truth that had been invisible before. The coffins were never empty to them. They contained concentrated essence of their dimension, quantum patterns that would help stabilize the transition. We couldn't see it with human perception, just as we couldn't see them in their natural state. As the team finalized their sanitized report, Eleanor felt the subtle pulse of the pocket dimension resonating through her consciousness. The entities were establishing their new existence, building structures of thought and energy in the space between realities. They were fulfilling their promise, remaining separate yet connected. Refugees granted sanctuary without displacing those who had saved them. The photograph that had started everything now hung framed on the wall. 6 pallbearers carrying what only Eleanor could now see wasn't empty at all, but filled with the hope of a civilization that had found its way home. The archives of the Camden Historical Society held one final secret, a weathered journal bound in cracked leather that Eleanor discovered while reorganizing the basement records. The handwriting on its cover had faded to near invisibility, but her enhanced perception revealed the name, Elizabeth Marsh, 1842. Her ancestors' journal began conventionally enough, with observations about household matters and social engagements. But following her nervous collapse, the writing changed dramatically, not just in content, but in fundamental structure. Diagrams occupied the margins, equations no human mathematician would conceive sprawled across pages, and observations about humanity written as if from an outsider's perspective. The vessel integration proceeds more successfully than previous attempts, Elizabeth had written. Though this biology requires constant maintenance, it provides adequate housing for a portion of my consciousness. The remaining awareness maintains connection with our dimension while this fragment experiences human existence. With trembling hands, Eleanor turned to the final entries. The experiment proves partial success. This vessel's genetic structure has been permanently altered, modifications that will transmit to offspring. Each generation should show increased compatibility. I estimate 7 reproductive cycles before complete integration becomes possible. This lineage will become our salvation when the diminishing reaches critical threshold. Eleanor's expanded consciousness suddenly grasped the horrifying truth. The travelers hadn't been selecting hosts from her family line. They had created her family line. Elizabeth Marsh wasn't her ancestor who had been temporarily possessed. She was the first successful traveler who had permanently remained in human form, deliberately breeding to create the perfect bridge. They've been planning this since before the Civil War, Eleanor whispered to the empty archive room. The final page contained a precise astronomical calculation, predicting the exact alignment that had occurred when Eleanor discovered the empty coffin photograph. The margin note read simply, "When our daughter's 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 daughter awakens to her purpose, the circle completes. 7 generations, exactly as the genetic testing had indicated." Eleanor wasn't just their bridge, she was them. Part of her had always been them. The photograph hadn't called to her by coincidence. It had activated dormant aspects of her consciousness that had been waiting for generations. The cemetery obelisk made perfect sense now. It wasn't a monument, but a genetic marker, placed to identify the location where their carefully cultivated bloodline would eventually return to fulfill its purpose. The entities hadn't needed to force their way into her consciousness because they already existed within her genetic code. Fragments of awareness planted by Elizabeth Marsh, 7 generations earlier, patiently waiting to awaken. Eleanor closed the journal, understanding at last why the transformation had felt simultaneously alien and familiar. She wasn't becoming something other. She was finally becoming what she had always been meant to be, the culmination of a plan set in motion almost 2 centuries ago by beings who measured time very differently than humans did. The empty coffin had never been meant for a body. It had been meant for her all along. The truth shattered Eleanor's sense of identity like a stone through fragile glass. She sat alone in her apartment that evening. Elizabeth Marsh's journal open beside a tumbler of whiskey she couldn't bring herself to drink. Outside her window, Camden continued its ordinary rhythm. People returning from work, lights flickering on in neighboring houses, all blissfully unaware of what walked among them. Not just among them, of them. Eleanor caught her reflection in the darkened window and studied her face with new awareness. Had Elizabeth Marsh's features always lurked beneath her own? Had her fascination with history been genuine, or merely the dormant programming of entities that had planned her existence across centuries? "Who am I really?" she whispered to the empty room. The team noticed the change immediately when she arrived at their morning meeting. Eleanor moved differently, spoke with subtle alterations in cadence, not obvious enough to alarm strangers but unmistakable to those who knew her well. "You've discovered something," Professor Blackwell said, not a question, but a statement. Eleanor placed Elizabeth's journal on the table between them. As they read, expressions shifted from shock to horror to a reluctant understanding. Dr. Whitney was the first to speak after the terrible silence. "This doesn't change who you are now, Eleanor, doesn't it?" Her laugh held no humor. "I'm the culmination of an alien breeding program. My entire family line was engineered. How much of what I consider me was ever real?" Martin studied her with new wariness. "If you're partly them already, how do we know you're still you?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor couldn't blame him. She'd asked herself the same thing repeatedly through a sleepless night. "Because I'm asking that question," she finally answered. "Because it matters to me. Because I'm terrified." The altered perception that had seemed miraculous now felt invasive. Not a gift, but an inheritance she'd never asked for. She could feel the entities in the pocket dimension responding to her distress, their consciousness brushing against hers with what might have been concern. Talia, who had remained silent, suddenly stood. "We need to track down other branches of your family tree. If Elizabeth Marsh was patient zero, there might be others, cousins, distant relatives who carry diluted versions of the same genetic modifications." The implication struck them all simultaneously. If Eleanor was the culmination of 7 direct generations, how many partial bridges might exist around the world? How many people carried fragments of traveler consciousness within them without knowing? Camden Cemetery's obelisk had begun attracting visitors, sensitive individuals drawn to its subtle, energetic emanations without understanding why. 3 had been found meditating at its base yesterday, claiming they heard music from beneath the ground. The sanctuary wasn't just a refuge, it was a foothold, and Eleanor, intended as a bridge between worlds, now stood at a different crossroads entirely, between accepting her designed purpose and asserting whatever humanity remained truly her own. In her pocket, her phone chimed with a calendar notification. Her mother's birthday next week. The woman who had unknowingly carried the 6th generation of carefully cultivated traveler DNA. Who else in her family was not quite what they appeared to be? Eleanor knelt before her mother's grave in the quiet corner of Ravenwood Cemetery, far from the obelisk and its otherworldly emanations. Snow crunched beneath her knees as she placed white lilies against the headstone. Margaret Marsh had passed 3 years ago from early-onset Alzheimer's, a disease that now took on disturbing new significance. Was that their failsafe? Eleanor whispered to the silent stone. If a vessel became too aware, did something in your modified genetics activate to erase your memory? The cemetery remained silent, but through her altered perception, Eleanor felt subtle vibrations from the pocket dimension. Neither confirmation nor denial, merely acknowledgement of her question. She brushed snow from the dates engraved on the stone, wondering how much of her mother had truly been human. Back at the Historical Society, Eleanor found Dr. Whitney examining the original photograph under specialized equipment. The empty coffin image had physically changed since the dimensional bridge formed, subtle alterations visible only under specific light frequencies. "The coffin isn't empty anymore," he said without looking up. "When viewed under quantum resonance imaging, it contains a perfect replica of the obelisk." Eleanor wasn't surprised. The photograph was never evidence. It was a blueprint, a key to unlock what was already inside me. She had made her decision during the long night spent at her mother's grave. Eleanor removed a sealed envelope from her bag and placed it on the table. "These are coordinates for 23 individuals across North America who share significant portions of my genetic markers, distant cousins from branches where Elizabeth Marsh's descendants intermarried with other families. They'll be experiencing symptoms they can't explain, dreams of other dimensions, perceptions that don't match consensus reality. You're proposing we find them? Professor Blackwell asked. I'm proposing we help them understand what they are, Eleanor corrected. What we are. Not simply vessels or bridges, but something unprecedented. A genuine hybridization evolving towards something neither fully human nor entirely traveler. Martin studied her face carefully. You've made peace with it. Not peace, Eleanor said softly, but purpose. Someone needs to monitor the sanctuary, ensure the covenant remains unbroken. Who better than those of us who exist in both worlds already? That evening, Eleanor returned to the farmhouse where it had all begun. The concentric circles remained burned into the wooden floor, but now she understood their true function, not to summon or contain, but to awaken what had always been dormant within her genetic code. She placed the original photograph in the center of the circles. As moonlight filtered through the windows, the image began to change before her eyes, the empty coffin procession transforming into something else entirely. A family tree with branches extending beyond the paper's edge, names written in both human language and traveler symbols. Eleanor Marsh's name appeared at the bottom, but beneath it stretched a dotted line extending toward the future. Not an ending, but a continuation. A story still unfolding across dimensions that now relied on her to maintain their delicate balance. Eleanor established a research center in the farmhouse, transforming the space that once hosted dark rituals into a sanctuary of knowledge. The concentric circles remained burned into the floorboards, now serving as a subtle reminder of boundaries that should never again be crossed. Maps covered the walls, marking the locations of the other 23 genetic relatives she had identified, each one a partial bridge carrying fragments of traveler consciousness. The first to arrive was Daniel Foster from Oregon, a distant cousin through Elizabeth Marsh's younger sister. He brought with him journals documenting 3 generations of family oddities, moments of impossible knowledge, perceptions that defied explanation, and recurring dreams of cities built from thought rather than matter. I've been seeing things since I was a child, he explained, his hands trembling slightly. Doctors called it temporal lobe epilepsy, but medications never helped. I always knew there was something else, something inside me that wasn't entirely me. Over the following months, 17 of the 23 identified carriers made the journey to Camden. Each brought similar stories of alienation and confusion, of living between worlds without understanding why. Eleanor guided them through the process she had already navigated, accepting the hybrid nature of their consciousness without surrendering their humanity. They established what they called the Threshold Protocol, guidelines for maintaining balance between human identity and traveler awareness. Those who struggled with the integration received support from those who had achieved stability. Together they learned to access the knowledge flowing from the pocket dimension without becoming lost in it. Dr. Whitney's research into their unique physiology yielded remarkable medical applications. Compounds derived from their altered cellular structure showed promise in treating neurodegenerative diseases, including the same condition that had claimed Eleanor's mother. The first clinical trials began quietly at research hospitals across the country. The Orpheum Society's vast financial resources, now under Eleanor's control, funded their work without attracting undue attention. What had once been an instrument of manipulation became a tool for healing and understanding. Not everyone embraced their hybrid nature. 3 carriers rejected the truth entirely, choosing to have no further contact with Eleanor or the others. She respected their decision while monitoring them from a distance, ensuring they remained stable despite their denial. The entities in the pocket dimension continued their own evolution, developing a civilization that existed alongside humanity without intersecting except through the bridges. They honored the covenant, never attempting to expand beyond the sanctuary Eleanor had created. Their gratitude manifested as knowledge freely shared, solutions to problems human science had barely begun to formulate. As the first anniversary of the alignment approached, Eleanor stood before the obelisk in Ravenwood Cemetery, her consciousness simultaneously present in both worlds. The initial fear and resentment she had felt upon discovering her designed heritage had transformed into something more complex. Not full acceptance, but a determined resolve to reshape the legacy she had inherited. "We are not what they intended," she told the gathered carriers. "They created us as tools, but we choose our own purpose now." The snow fell gently on Camden as Eleanor stood before the display case in the Historical Society's main gallery. Behind the protective glass, The infamous photograph of the empty coffin procession drew visitors daily. The exhibition, Photographic Anomalies, When History Reveals Its Secrets, had become the most popular in the Society's 100-year existence. Eleanor smiled as a young woman pressed her face close to the glass, studying the 6 pallbearers with their uncanny similarities. "Can you see it?" Eleanor asked, approaching quietly. The woman startled. "See what?" "Look at the coffin again. Not with your eyes forward, but from the side." The woman tilted her head obediently, then gasped. From an oblique angle, the seemingly empty coffin appeared to contain a shimmering outline, invisible when viewed directly. "That's impossible," the woman whispered. "The image changes depending on viewing position." "Quantum photography," Eleanor explained, using the term she'd coined for the hybrid technology the carriers had developed. "Reality isn't fixed. Why should its documentation be?" 5 years had passed since the creation of the sanctuary. The 20 carriers who had embraced their heritage now occupied influential positions across science, medicine, and education, subtly guiding humanity toward greater understanding without revealing the true source of their insights. The modified genetics continued to spread through natural reproduction, creating a growing population with heightened perception, not enough to access the pocket dimension but sufficient to sense its presence. Eleanor touched the woman's shoulder gently, feeling the familiar resonance. "You're Sarah Collins, aren't you? From Minnesota?" The woman's eyes widened. "How did you—" "You've been having dreams about buildings that couldn't possibly stand. About mathematics that solves itself while you sleep." Eleanor handed her a business card with the now familiar concentric circles embossed in silver. "You're not alone, Sarah. You're 24th generation through Elizabeth's brother's line." That evening, Eleanor visited the obelisk at Ravenwood, where a small garden of otherworldly flowers now bloomed year-round. Plants that existed simultaneously in both dimensions, their impossible colors visible only to those with the genetic markers. They were the physical manifestation of the covenant, beauty emerging from the space between worlds. She placed her hand on the stone, feeling the entity's consciousness respond to her presence. After 5 years of coexistence, they had developed a relationship based on mutual respect, rather than the manipulation that had marked their initial approach. The sanctuary flourished, and humanity benefited from knowledge filtered through the carrier's understanding. Eleanor opened her journal to the photograph she kept pressed between its pages. Not the empty coffin procession that had started everything, but an older image she had discovered in Elizabeth's belongings. It showed a woman standing beside a different obelisk in a different cemetery, her face unmistakably similar to Eleanor's own. On the back, written in Elizabeth's hand, "The cycle begins. May our daughters' daughters forgive what necessity requires." Eleanor closed the journal. Some secrets would remain hers alone, including her suspicion that Elizabeth's integration hadn't been the beginning, but merely another step in a pattern extending far deeper into history than even the travelers remembered. The empty coffin had never been empty. It had contained the future, her future, waiting patiently to be discovered. Another photograph, another dark secret revealed. Until next time, this has been Shadow Frames.